My name is Adelaide Harrington. I am 28 years old. 6 months ago, I stood in a freezing Detroit garage at 2 a.m. holding an eviction notice signed by my own father. In front of me, my husband's life work, a revolutionary engine prototype, was catching fire. We had 72 hours to vacate the premises. My father, a billionaire real estate mogul, bought the commercial mortgage to our shop just to crush us. He wanted to prove that leaving my multi-million-dollar trust fund for a blue-collar mechanic was the biggest mistake of my life. He almost succeeded. But he did not know that exact prototype would soon secure an $80 million patent buyout from the most powerful industrialist in Michigan. When the news hit the financial wires, the first call I got was from my mother. Her voicemail started with, "Sweetheart, we miss you." I deleted it without listening. Before I tell you exactly how we legally dismantled my family's empire in front of 500 of their closest friends, please take a moment to like and subscribe to Luke Vengeance. Also, I would love to know how old you are and where you are listening from today, so drop your age and location in the comments below. Now let me take you back to the night I walked away from the Crystal and chose the Grease. The dining room of my parents' Grosse Pointe estate was suffocating. My father, Richard Harrington, sat at the head of the mahogany table. My mother, Evelyn, sat across from him. Between them sat my husband, Jack. Jack is a self-taught master automotive engineer. He is brilliant, but his hands carry the permanent dark stains of motor oil. In my family's world of pristine manicures and imported champagne, those hands were considered an insult. They worshipped my older brother's medical degree, flying him business class and treating him to Michelin star dinners. But my art direction career and Jack's mechanical genius were the family embarrassment. My parents forgot that the entire state of Michigan was built by gritty pioneers in garages just like Jack. That night, my father decided he had had enough. He placed a platinum envelope on the table and looked directly at me. "Adelaide," he said, his voice flat and cold, "I have the annulment papers drawn up. Sign them tomorrow. Leave this grease monkey, or I freeze your trust fund tonight. You will lose your inheritance, your apartment, and your standing in this family." He slid the envelope closer. "Put your credit cards inside, and we can pretend this humiliating phase never happened." The room went dead silent. I looked at Jack, expecting him to shrink under the weight of my father's wealth. Instead, Jack took a slow sip of his water. He set the crystal glass down and looked toward the large bay windows overlooking the circular driveway. "Your new vintage Mustang is idling rough, Mr. Harrington," Jack said calmly. "You have an auditory knock in the left cylinder bank. Your luxury dealership missed it entirely. The timing belt is going to snap within 100 miles. My father stared at him, his face reddening with anger. "How dare you speak to me about my cars, you arrogant mechanic?" I did not hesitate. I reached into my purse, pulled out my platinum credit cards, and dropped them into the envelope. I did not argue. I simply took Jack's calloused hand, stood up, and walked out the front door into the biting Michigan cold. I knew the moment the heavy oak door clicked shut that we were going to war. I just did not realize how far my father would go to ensure we starved. Walking down the sweeping stone steps of the Harrington estate, the January wind hit us like a physical blow. The circular driveway was lined with imported luxury vehicles belonging to my parents' dinner guests, but my attention was immediately drawn to my father's prized possession. The vintage Mustang idled near the grand entrance, sending thick white exhaust into the freezing night air. Jack stopped walking. He tilted his head, listening to the engine with the focused intensity of a surgeon examining a vital organ. He pointed toward the hood and told me to listen closely. Beneath the deep rumble of the exhaust, there was a faint metallic ticking sound, an auditory knock. Jack explained that the luxury dealership mechanics had tuned the engine for vanity, adjusting the idle to sound deeper, but they ignored the timing belt tensioner. He said the pistons were misfiring by a fraction of a millisecond, and within 100 miles, that engine would tear itself apart from the inside. That observation was not just a passing comment, it was a testament to his genius. While my father paid exorbitant fees for prestige, Jack understood the soul of the machine. I squeezed his calloused hand, feeling the deep grooves of permanent grease against my skin, and we walked toward his battered pickup truck. Leaving Grosse Pointe felt like crossing a border between two different worlds. Behind us sat the manicured lawns, the country clubs, and the people who believed wealth dictated human worth. My parents proudly worshipped my older brother's medical degree, flying him across the country in business class and treating him to 5-star dinners simply for passing his exams. They viewed my degree and my career as trivial hobbies, and they viewed Jack as a disease. They forgot that Detroit, the very city that funded their elite lifestyle, was built by men with dirt under their fingernails. The automotive pioneers who changed the world did not start in boardrooms. They started in drafty sheds, tinkering with gears and fuel lines. Jack was the true heir to that legacy. He did not have an Ivy League diploma. He learned thermodynamics by reading discarded engineering textbooks late into the night and testing his theories on broken-down engines. As we drove down Jefferson Avenue, the streetlights transitioned from ornate vintage lamps to harsh industrial halogens. The silence in the truck was heavy, but it was not the silence of defeat. It was the calm before a long war. I pulled out my phone, intending to transfer whatever personal funds I had left into a joint account. I opened my banking application and watched the screen load. A red error message flashed across the display, stating my account was restricted. My father had not waited until morning. He had already called his private bankers. He did not just freeze my trust fund. He froze my personal checking account, my savings, and the emergency credit card I had held since I was a teenager. I was financially erased. The fuel gauge on Jack's truck hovered near empty. We pulled into a rundown gas station on the edge of the city limits. I stepped out into the bitter wind and walked inside the brightly lit convenience store, holding the only card I had not surrendered. It was a basic debit card from a local credit union tied to my freelance art direction earnings. I handed it to the cashier to pay for $20 worth of gas. The terminal beeped a sharp declining tone, indicating insufficient funds. My father had somehow tracked and frozen that account too, using his leverage over the regional banking executives. I stood there under the flickering fluorescent lights, staring at the piece of plastic in my hand. The reality of my choice crashed over me. I had $0 to my name. I walked back to the truck and told Jack the truth. He did not flinch. He simply reached into his worn leather wallet, pulled out a crumpled $20 bill, and paid for the fuel himself. He looked at me with steady, quiet eyes and promised me we would survive this. We drove the rest of the way to the Sullivan Auto Repair Shop in silence. The building was an old brick warehouse nestled deep in the industrial sector of downtown Detroit. When Jack unlocked the heavy, corrugated metal door, the air inside was barely warmer than the winter night outside. He flicked a switch, and pale overhead lights flickered to life, revealing our new reality. The contrast was jarring. My sleek drafting table and expensive art portfolios were pushed into a corner, leaning against heavy steel hoists and greasy toolboxes. The smell of synthetic oil and metal shavings permeated everything. There was no central heating, just a small space heater, glowing orange in the corner of the tiny apartment built above the shop floor. I kept my winter coat on as I carried my single suitcase up the metal stairs. This was the battlefield my father had forced us into. He assumed the brutal physical discomfort of blue-collar life would break my spirit. He believed that within a month I would be crying at his front gate, begging for my trust fund and signing the annulment papers. He profoundly underestimated both of us. Instead of despair, I felt a strange surge of inspiration. Looking around the garage, I saw raw, unpolished potential. The metallic textures, the sharp angles of the machinery, the sparks from the welding torch, they formed a gritty, authentic aesthetic that I knew I could use for my independent art direction agency. But survival was not going to be simple. Jack was working grueling 18-hour days. From sunrise to sunset, he repaired broken-down sedans just to keep the lights on and pay for our meager groceries. By night, he bent over his workbench, painstakingly prototyping a revolutionary injection manifold. His design was intended to solve the exact thermal latency flaws that major tech corporations were currently struggling with in their hybrid transitions. It was a brilliant concept, but it required resources we simply no longer had. Every piece of raw material he bought meant skipping a meal or turning off the space heater. The physical toll on him was immense. His hands cracked from the cold and the harsh industrial soaps, but he never complained. I spent my days pitching art direction concepts to local businesses, using the gritty backdrop of the garage as my unique selling point. We were surviving on instant noodles and sheer willpower. The starvation tactics meant to drive us apart were instead forging us into a unified, unstoppable front. The next morning, my phone buzzed on the drafting table. It was a text message from my mother's personal assistant. The message was brief and clinical, stating that my presence was required at a society luncheon the following week to dispel unfortunate rumors regarding my sudden departure. My mother, Evelyn, was already spinning the narrative. She was preparing to launch a coordinated social attack, painting Jack as a manipulator and me as a naive victim who needed rescuing. If I did not attend, she would ensure every high-end client in my professional network dropped my services. The financial freeze was only the opening move. The real sabotage was just beginning, and we had to figure out how to fight a war with empty pockets. Living in the apartment above the auto repair shop felt like existing inside a percussion instrument. Every morning at 6 sharp, the heavy rhythmic thud of air compressors and the shrill whine of pneumatic drills vibrated up through the thin floorboards. My previous mornings in Grosse Pointe had consisted of silent maids pouring imported coffee into porcelain cups. Now I woke up to the smell of exhaust fumes and the biting chill of a drafty room. The visual contrast was jarring. My high-end art direction portfolios, filled with glossy mock-ups for luxury brands, leaned against heavy steel engine blocks and stacks of greasy service manuals. My silk dresses hung in a makeshift closet next to Jack's oil-stained canvas coveralls. I watched him prepare for the day. He grew up in the shadow of the automotive plants, learning the rhythm of pistons and crankshafts from his late grandfather, who spent 40 years on an assembly line. Jack carried that legacy in his hands. He did not care about the superficial prestige my family worshipped. He only cared about the undeniable truth of a working machine. I sat at my drafting table wearing a heavy wool sweater, trying to salvage my remaining freelance contracts. Before my father cut me off, I managed visual branding for some of the most affluent boutiques and galleries in the state. I opened my laptop, expecting to see approved proofs for an upcoming spring gala. Instead, my inbox was a graveyard of cancellations. One after another, my clients backed out. The emails cited vague scheduling conflicts or sudden budget cuts, but the timing was impossible to ignore. I picked up my phone and called the gallery owner I had known for 5 years. She hesitated, her voice tight and uncomfortable. She quietly admitted that she had attended a country club luncheon hosted by my mother. At that luncheon, my mother played the role of the tragic, heartbroken matriarch flawlessly. She poured tears into her champagne glass, spinning a devastating lie. She told the wealthiest people in our social circle that Jack was a predatory gold digger who had manipulated me into leaving my home. She claimed I was suffering from a mental breakdown and that hiring me would only fund my continued descent into poverty. My mother was deliberately gaslighting the entire community to ensure my professional starvation. She knew that without my income, we could not fund Jack's prototype. The social elite, eager to stay in the good graces of my father's billionaire real estate empire, fell in line without asking a single question. The financial strangulation was designed to force a surrender. I closed my laptop, staring at the blank screen. A familiar hollow ache formed in my chest, but I refused to let it settle. I walked downstairs to the garage floor. The air was thick with the scent of synthetic oil and burning metal. Jack was working underneath a rusted sedan, trying to salvage a shattered transmission, just to earn enough cash to pay our electric bill. I watched the bright orange sparks from his welding torch illuminate the dark corners of the shop. In that harsh industrial grit, I saw something profound. I saw the true, authentic soul of the city my parents pretended did not exist. I went back upstairs, grabbed my camera, and returned to the shop floor. I began capturing the metallic textures, the scored steel, the intricate blueprints scattered across the workbench, and the raw determination etched into Jack's soot-covered face. I threw away my luxury mock-ups and built a bold, new, independent art direction agency from the ground up. I rebranded my entire portfolio to focus on industrial resilience, targeting emerging startups and independent manufacturers who valued substance over superficial polish. I turned the weapon of my exile into my greatest creative asset. My pivot gave us a faint glimmer of hope, but the reality of our timeline was brutal. Jack was punishing his body, working grueling 18-hour shifts. By day, he diagnosed blown head gaskets and replaced worn brake pads on decade-old commuter cars. Every dollar he earned went toward basic survival, keeping the space heater running and buying cheap groceries. But when the sun went down and the garage doors locked, his true work began. He stepped away from the customer repairs and focused entirely on the injection manifold. The prototype sitting on the reinforced workbench was a masterpiece of thermodynamic engineering. It was designed to solve a critical heat displacement flaw that had plagued hybrid combustion engines for years. If he could perfect the pressure seals, it would revolutionize the industry, saving manufacturing giants billions in wasted energy. But prototyping required precise raw materials and expensive testing equipment we simply could not afford. We improvised. Jack machined custom parts from scrap metal using an old manual lathe. We ate cheap takeout sitting on overturned buckets next to the workbench, discussing airflow dynamics and marketing strategies late into the night. My parents believed poverty would break our marriage. They assumed the stress of empty bank accounts and freezing temperatures would turn us against each other. They were fundamentally wrong. Every shared hardship only forged an unbreakable partnership. When Jack's hands shook from exhaustion after a 12-hour repair shift, I stood beside him, holding the flashlight and handing him the correct wrenches so he could keep working on the manifold. When my fingers went numb typing out design pitches in the drafty apartment, he would stop his work to wrap a greasy, heavy canvas jacket around my shoulders. We were no longer just husband and wife. We were a specialized unit, fighting a war against a dynasty that wanted us erased. The starvation tactics were only making us sharper, more resourceful, and infinitely more dangerous. We had survived the first wave of the attack. We stabilized our meager income and kept the prototype moving forward despite the relentless pressure. I thought the worst of my mother's social sabotage was behind us. I believed we had outmaneuvered their initial strategy by simply refusing to quit. But my father was not a man who accepted a stalemate. If starving us out organically did not work, he was prepared to force the issue using far more insidious methods. The real threat was not the loss of my high society clients. The real threat was the silent corporate machinery my father was quietly mobilizing in the background. We were entirely focused on surviving the daily grind, unaware that a sophisticated net was closing around Jack's intellectual property. The realization of how deep my father's surveillance went did not come from a threatening phone call or a formal legal letter. It arrived late one evening, walking through the snow, carrying a basket of expensive groceries and a dire warning. It came from the one person in my extended family who understood exactly how ruthless my father could be, and she was about to reveal that our fight had barely even started. The winter storm outside howled against the corrugated metal walls of the Sullivan Auto Shop. The wind rattled the loose window panes, carrying the bitter chill of a deep freeze. Jack and I were huddled over the workbench, examining a set of worn gaskets, when a sharp, rhythmic knock echoed from the heavy steel bay door. We exchanged a tense glance. No customers ever came this late, and my father's emissaries usually preferred daytime intimidation. Jack picked up a heavy iron wrench just in case and walked toward the entrance. When he pulled the metal door upward, a swirl of white snow blew into the shop, followed by a tall, striking woman carrying 2 large paper bags. It was my cousin Vivian. Vivian is an African-American woman with a fierce, brilliant mind and an unyielding spirit. She runs a highly successful boutique public relations firm in the heart of the city. While my parents spent their lives climbing the rigid social ladders of the affluent suburbs, Vivian built her empire on the gritty pavement of real Detroit. Growing up, she intimately understood the brutal realities of class divides and racial barriers. My father always treated her achievements with thinly veiled condescension. He despised her independence and her refusal to play the submissive role he expected from extended family. Vivian saw right through Richard Harrington's toxic elitism. She knew his wealth was built on exploitation, while her success was built on genuine strategy and hard work. She stepped into the freezing garage, shaking the snow from her dark wool coat. She did not look at our harsh living conditions with pity. She looked around the oil-stained shop with deep respect. Vivian set the heavy paper bags on a clean section of the workbench. She had brought expensive groceries. There were thick cuts of fresh steak, organic vegetables, artisan bread, and rich, dark coffee. For two people surviving on cheap instant ramen, the sight of real, nourishing food felt like an incredible luxury. Jack set down his wrench and thanked her, his voice thick with genuine gratitude. Vivian smiled warmly at him. She respected Jack because she recognized a fellow architect of their own destiny. She knew he was a true innovator, not a pretender. But Vivian did not drive through a midnight blizzard just to deliver dinner. She unpacked the bags with sharp, precise movements, and her expression grew serious. She turned to me and explained that she still operated within the peripheral circles of my parents' high society network. Her public relations firm handled crisis management for several wealthy executives who regularly golfed with my father. People in those circles talked when they thought nobody important was listening. Vivian leaned against the steel workbench and delivered a chilling piece of intelligence. She warned us that my father had quietly hired a team of ruthless corporate private investigators. These investigators were not looking into our personal lives. They were relentlessly monitoring the United States Patent and Trademark Office filings. My father knew Jack was a mechanical genius. He suspected Jack was close to finalizing a major invention. Vivian explained the trap my father was setting. If Jack filed the preliminary patent paperwork before the prototype was flawlessly sealed and stress-tested, my father's legal team would immediately swamp the application with interference claims. They would bury Jack in frivolous intellectual property lawsuits. We had $0 to hire a defense attorney. My father planned to drag the process out in federal court until we went bankrupt, forcing Jack to surrender the intellectual property rights just to pay the legal fees. He wanted to crush Jack's spirit and steal his life work in one calculated strike. The air in the garage felt suddenly thinner. We were operating under a ticking clock, and we did not even know it. If we moved too early, we would lose the manifold to a corporate legal machine. If we moved too late, we would run out of money and freeze. We had to perfect the thermal seals and secure bulletproof, independent testing data before ever submitting a single sheet of paper to the government. While Jack absorbed the weight of this new timeline, Vivian walked over to the corner of the shop, examining the cracked brickwork near the foundation. She casually mentioned a seemingly minor detail she had picked up from a real estate developer earlier that week. She said, "My father's holding company had recently formed several anonymous shell corporations. These dummy entities were quietly buying up distressed commercial mortgages all across the downtown industrial district. They were targeting old warehouses and auto shops." I listened to her words, but the true danger did not register in my exhausted mind. I brushed it off as my father's typical, endless greed for more property. I assumed he was just gentrifying another neighborhood for profit. That subtle piece of information planted a small seed of unease in my stomach, but I failed to recognize the invisible snare closing around our own physical location. It was a failure of imagination that would soon cost us dearly. Vivian saw the heavy toll the stress was taking on my posture. She reached into her designer handbag and pulled out a sleek black folder, handing it to me. Inside was a formal contract for freelance art direction. She needed comprehensive branding for a new logistics client her firm was representing. But this was not a standard contract. Vivian explained she had routed the payment structure through a blind shell company. The money would flow into a secure digital account my father could never trace or freeze. She was offering us a covert financial lifeline. It was enough capital to pay the heating bill, buy the final thermodynamic testing sensors for the manifold, and keep food on our table. I felt a hard lump form in my throat. My own parents had thrown me to the wolves, but my estranged cousin was risking her own professional reputation to keep us alive. I signed the contract right there on the greasy workbench. Vivian gave me a fierce hug, telling me to keep fighting before she walked back out into the blinding snowstorm. Her visit fundamentally changed our strategy. We were no longer just trying to survive the winter. We were engaged in a high-stakes cat-and-mouse game with a billionaire. Jack redoubled his efforts, pushing his body to the physical limit to finish the prototype in total secrecy. I used Vivian's secure funds to purchase the necessary technical equipment, covering our digital tracks every step of the way. We operated like ghosts in our own city. We thought we had finally found a stable footing. We believed the secure funds and the knowledge of the private investigators gave us the upper hand. We were preparing for a long, quiet battle of endurance. But the timeline was about to accelerate in a terrifying direction. A few days later, the heavy garage door rolled open to reveal a man in a sharp, tailored suit. He did not look like a private investigator or a disgruntled customer. He introduced himself as an executive from Apex Motors, a mid-tier technology firm. He carried a sleek silver briefcase and wore a practiced, disarming smile. He told Jack he had heard rumors of a brilliant mechanic working on hybrid combustion solutions, and he was prepared to make a very lucrative offer. The sudden arrival of corporate interest felt like a miraculous stroke of luck. It felt like our salvation had finally arrived. We had no idea we were staring directly into the jaws of a meticulously disguised trap. The executive standing in the center of our freezing garage introduced himself as David Cole. He wore a tailored charcoal suit that looked entirely out of place against the backdrop of stained concrete and rusted tools. He represented Apex Motors, a mid-tier technology firm known for acquiring smaller, independent startups. David carried a sleek silver briefcase, which he set down on a clean patch of Jack's workbench with a deliberate, practiced gentleness. He claimed his company had been monitoring grassroots automotive trends and heard whispers of a brilliant local mechanic working on hybrid combustion solutions. David did not waste time with lengthy corporate pleasantries. He opened the silver briefcase and turned it toward us. Nestled inside the velvet lining was a certified cashier's check printed with the staggering sum of $100,000. Next to the check lay a thick-bound stack of legal documents. David explained that Apex Motors wanted to purchase the unfinished blueprints for the injection manifold. They were willing to pay the cash up front, taking on all the risk of final prototyping and testing themselves. He pitched it as a partnership, a way to relieve the immense financial pressure we were clearly under, while bringing a vital invention to the global market. For two people who had been calculating the exact cost of a single cup of coffee, that sum of money was a physical shock. $100,000 meant instant salvation. It meant turning on the central heating, repairing the broken water pipes, and buying fresh groceries for a year. It meant Jack would no longer have to break his back replacing transmissions on rusted sedans for 12 hours a day. He could rest his calloused hands. Jack stared at the check. I watched his posture shift, the heavy burden of our recent poverty visibly weighing on his shoulders. Jack grew up watching his grandfather give 4 decades of his life to a corporate assembly line, only to retire with a pension that barely covered his medical bills. In Jack's world, working-class men did not get handed 6-figure checks. They bled for every single dime. The temptation to reach out and take the money was profound. He looked at the cash, and then he looked at me, standing near the space heater, shivering in a worn wool sweater. I could read the exact thought passing through his mind. He wanted to rescue me. He wanted to buy me a warm coat, a safe apartment, and a comfortable life far away from the biting chill of the industrial district. David Cole smiled, sensing the hesitation, and urged Jack to sign the preliminary agreement right then and there. He called it a standard acquisition contract, suggesting the window for such a generous offer was incredibly narrow. That false sense of urgency triggered an immediate alarm in my mind. During my time managing visual branding for elite clientele, I had learned how to read between the lines of high-stakes negotiations. I stepped forward and placed my hand over the thick stack of papers. I told David we needed 24 hours to review the terms. The executive's smile tightened a fraction of an inch, his eyes flashing with brief irritation, before he smoothed his expression. He agreed, leaving the contract on the workbench and promising to return the following morning. That night, the temperature plummeted again. Jack fell into a deep, exhausted sleep on our small mattress, while I sat at my drafting table wrapped in blankets, staring at the dense legal text under the glow of a single desk lamp. The contract was 40 pages long, filled with complex jargon and convoluted phrasing. I treated the document the same way I treated a flawed design proof. My art director training taught me to look for anomalies in structure and spacing. Corporations often used layout tricks, shrinking the kerning between letters or packing dense paragraphs together to fatigue the reader's eyes and hide unfavorable terms. I read every single line. Around 3 a.m, on page 38, buried deep within a section labeled Secondary Intellectual Property Licensing, I found the trap. It was a perpetuity clause cleverly disguised as standard legal protection. The wording stated that by accepting the initial payment, Jack would grant Apex Motors exclusive licensing rights, not only to the current manifold blueprints, but to any derivative technologies, improvements, or subsequent automotive patents he ever filed for the remainder of his natural life. If Jack signed that paper, he would not be entering a partnership. He would be selling himself into intellectual servitude. Apex Motors would own his mind forever. Every future innovation, every late-night breakthrough, every brilliant thermodynamic concept he ever conceived would automatically belong to a mid-tier corporation that paid him pennies on the dollar. It was an enslavement contract dressed up as a rescue mission. I carried the heavy document over to the bed and gently woke Jack. He rubbed his tired eyes, sitting up as I showed him the highlighted paragraph. I explained the true cost of that $100,000 check. Jack read the words, his jaw tightening. The exhaustion in his posture was replaced by a deep, quiet anger. But it was quickly followed by a heavy, lingering doubt. He rubbed his oil-stained knuckles and looked at the frosty windows. He whispered that maybe we should just take the deal anyway. He pointed out that we were running out of time and resources. The prototype was far from finished, and the space heater was failing. He told me he could not stand watching me lose my entire world just to live in a freezing garage. He was willing to sacrifice his future potential just to guarantee my present safety. I felt a sharp ache in my chest, not from despair, but from the profound depth of his loyalty. I reached out and placed my clean hand firmly over his grease-stained one. I looked directly into his eyes and told him his genius was worth infinitely more than a desperate payout. I reminded him that my family had spent my entire life trying to dictate my worth based on their bank accounts, and I refused to let another corporation do the same thing to him. We were building our own legacy, and we would not sell our foundation for a temporary comfort. I told him I would rather freeze in this shop with a free man than live in a penthouse funded by his servitude. The tension in his shoulders finally released. The doubt vanished from his eyes, replaced by a renewed, hardened resolve. We made the decision together without a shred of regret. When David Cole returned to the garage the next morning, he carried an expensive pen, expecting a swift victory. Jack did not say a word. He simply picked up the thick contract and slid it across the cold steel workbench, returning it to the executive. Jack calmly stated that the manifold was no longer for sale and requested that David leave the premises. The transformation in David Cole was instantaneous. The charming, supportive corporate sponsor facade dissolved. His posture stiffened, and his eyes turned cold and calculating. He did not try to renegotiate or offer a higher sum. He packed the contract back into his silver briefcase, snapping the latches shut with a sharp, definitive click. Before walking out into the snow, David offered a tight, humorless smile and remarked that some decisions carry a much heavier cost than people realize. That parting comment hung in the freezing air long after the bay door closed. It did not sound like a standard business rejection. It sounded like a deliberate warning. As I watched his luxury sedan drive away through the snow-covered streets, My mind began racing. A mid-tier firm like Apex Motors had no reason to target an unknown local mechanic with such a predatory contract, unless they had been tipped off. They had moved too fast, offering too much cash for an unfinished concept. Then Vivian's earlier warning echoed in my thoughts. My father's private investigators had been monitoring the patent filings. My father was a silent master of manipulation. Apex Motors was not a random vulture circling our garage. They were a carefully deployed diversion. My father had sent them to trap Jack legally, knowing we were desperate for cash. By refusing the contract, we had not just turned down a tech firm. We had actively defied my father's first trap. The realization sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the winter weather. We had survived the legal ambush, but in doing so, we had forced my father to abandon his subtle tactics. If he could not own the intellectual property through a proxy contract, he would come for the physical prototype itself. Our refusal had inadvertently triggered the next phase of his retaliation, proving that the true, devastating attack was still waiting in the shadows. We had to move the manifold and secure independent backing before his invisible net tightened around our throats. The taillights of the Apex Motors sedan disappeared into the blinding white snow, leaving a profound silence in their wake. I stood by the frosted window of the garage, processing the sheer speed of their retreat. Corporate negotiators do not simply walk away from revolutionary technology after a single rejection. They haggle, they pressure, they return with higher numbers and sharper threats. David Cole had done none of those things. He closed his silver briefcase with the calm certainty of a man who already knew he possessed a winning hand. That certainty gnawed at the edges of my mind. I wrapped my heavy wool sweater tighter around my shoulders and climbed the metal stairs to our freezing apartment. I opened my laptop and began to dig. During my years working in high-end visual branding, I developed a specific skill set. Designing corporate identities requires deep research into subsidiary structures, shell companies, and holding firms. I knew how the elite hid their money because I used to design the letterheads for their phantom corporations. I pulled up the state business registry and searched for Apex Motors. On the surface, they appeared as an independent technology incubator, but tracing their board of directors revealed a familiar pattern. 3 of their executive members held concurrent positions at a private equity firm. I cross-referenced that private equity firm with the guest list of my parents' annual charity gala. The connection emerged like a shark breaking the surface of the water. My father, Richard, was the silent majority shareholder of that exact equity firm. Apex Motors was never an independent vulture. They were a proxy, a hunting dog sent by my own father. But the puzzle still felt incomplete. If my father wanted the manifold, why did his proxy retreat so easily? I stared at the glowing screen, the cold draft from the window chilling my face. Then the memory of Vivian's midnight visit struck me. She had warned us about dummy entities quietly purchasing distressed commercial mortgages in the downtown industrial sector. At the time, I assumed it was just another gentrification project. I opened a new browser tab and accessed the Wayne County Public Property Database. My fingers were stiff from the cold as I typed the address of Jack's auto repair shop into the search bar. The page loaded, displaying a long history of ownership. Jack had been renting this warehouse for 5 years from an elderly landlord who barely maintained the roof. I scrolled down to the most recent transaction log. Just 3 days ago, the deed had been transferred. The new owner was listed as a limited liability company with a generic numeric name. I traced the registered agent for that numerical company. It led back to the same private equity firm. My father did not just own Apex Motors. He now owned the very concrete beneath our feet. The true nature of the trap locked into place. I opened the municipal legal code for commercial leases, scanning the dense paragraphs until I found the specific statute covering tenant default. There it was, the landlord's lien. The law stated that if a commercial tenant faced eviction for falling behind on rent, the landlord possessed the legal right to seize all physical property left on the premises to cover the debt. My father knew we were starving. He knew we could barely afford groceries, let alone the upcoming monthly lease payment. He did not need Jack to sign the enslavement contract. The Apex Motors offer was a red herring, designed to make us feel victorious for rejecting it. While we were distracted celebrating our moral high ground, my father was preparing to legally evict us. The moment we failed to pay the rent, he would post a notice on the door, lock us out, and claim the shop. Under the landlord's lien, he would legally confiscate the hoists, the tools, and the steel injection manifold prototype sitting right on the workbench. He would steal Jack's life work without paying a single cent, and the local courts would uphold it as a standard real estate procedure. A profound, sickening realization washed over me. This was not a test of my endurance. This was an execution. My father was systematically dismantling our existence with the cold precision of a surgeon. I closed the laptop, the screen snapping shut with a sharp, definitive sound. I stood up and walked over to a small wooden chest sitting in the corner of our makeshift bedroom. It held the few personal items I had taken with me the night I walked out of Grosse Pointe. I opened the lid and sifted through the contents until I found a silver-framed photograph. It was a picture of my father and me, taken during a summer sailing trip on Lake Michigan. I was 18 years old, smiling brightly, holding the helm of his yacht, while he stood behind me, looking proud and invincible. For a long time I had kept that picture because a small, naive part of my heart believed he still loved me. I believed his cruelty was just a harsh lesson, a misguided attempt to force me back into the safety of his world. Holding the silver frame in the freezing apartment, I finally saw the truth. A father who loves his daughter does not orchestrate her ruin. He does not weaponize starvation or steal the future of the man she loves. The man in the photograph was not a protector. He was a predator who viewed his own children as assets to be managed or liquidated. I removed the photograph from the silver frame. The glossy paper felt cold against my fingertips. I did not cry. My eyes were entirely dry. With slow, calculated, deliberate movements, I tore the photograph exactly in half, separating my smiling face from his. I dropped his half into the small plastic trash bin beside the desk. I placed my half back into the wooden chest. The emotional fracture was absolute. The final tether to my past severed clean. I walked back downstairs to the shop floor. Jack was still at the workbench holding a micrometer, studying the cracked pressure seals of the manifold. He looked up as I approached, noticing the shift in my posture. I did not look like a frightened exile anymore. I explained everything I had just discovered. I laid out the corporate connections, the purchase of the mortgage, and the devastating reality of the landlord's lien. Jack listened in silence. He looked around the garage, his eyes tracing the brick walls and the heavy steel beams. This shop had been his sanctuary. It was the only place where he was judged solely by the quality of his work and not the pedigree of his background. The thought of my father invading this space, stealing the tools Jack had painstakingly collected over a decade, ignited a fierce protective fire in his expression. I told him we could no longer play defense. Waiting for the next attack was a guaranteed death sentence. If we stayed in the garage until the end of the month, the eviction notice would arrive, and the trap would snap shut. We had to physically remove the prototype and all essential testing equipment from the premises before the first of the month. We had to vanish from my father's radar. But hiding the manifold was only half the battle. Without securing independent funding and finalizing the patent, we were just delaying the inevitable. We needed a stage to present the invention to the world, a place where my father's invisible influence could not reach us. We needed to launch a proactive, silent ambush. Jack set the micrometer down on the bench. He nodded, his jaw set tight with determination. We had less than 2 weeks to fix the thermal seals, build a flawless presentation model, and find a way to transport it to the only venue that mattered, the upcoming Detroit Auto Show. It was the epicenter of the American automotive industry. If we could get the manifold on that floor and attract a genuine backer before the eviction date hit, we could outmaneuver the entire Harrington empire. The pacing of our lives shifted from a grueling marathon to a breathless, high-stakes sprint. The hunt was on. But my father was about to learn that we were no longer his prey. We were the predators circling his blind spot. The timeline snapped shut with the arrival of a legal courier. It was the dead of winter, and a blinding snowstorm battered the industrial district. A man in a heavy parka pounded on the metal bay door, handed me a thick manila folder, and quickly retreated to his idling car. Inside the folder was the formal eviction notice. The document granted us exactly 72 hours to vacate the premises. My father's holding company had executed their landlord's lien perfectly. We were officially out of time. The pressure inside the garage became a tangible, suffocating presence. We had to prove the injection manifold worked before we dismantled the shop to flee. Jack connected the prototype to a diagnostic testing rig. He bypassed the standard safety regulators to simulate maximum hybrid combustion stress. The metallic block vibrated with immense kinetic energy. Thermal sensors glowed bright green on the digital monitoring screen. For 3 glorious minutes, the engine ran with flawless, unprecedented efficiency. Then, the structural integrity yielded. A high-pitched hiss pierced the freezing air. The thermodynamic pressure seals ruptured under the intense synthetic load. A sharp pop echoed off the concrete walls, followed instantly by thick, acrid smoke. Flames erupted from the manifold casing, casting wild orange shadows across the shop floor. The timeline caught up to the exact moment I described earlier. I stood there, holding the eviction notice in one hand, while the other gripped the industrial fire extinguisher. I pulled the pin and blanketed the failing prototype in chemical foam. The fire died, leaving behind a devastating silence. The foam dripped off the scorched steel, sizzling against the hot metal. Jack stepped back from the workbench. He was covered in soot and engine grease. His broad shoulders slumped, bearing the crushing weight of utter defeat. We were completely out of capital. The materials required to machine a new block and purchase stronger aerospace-grade seals cost thousands of dollars. Our bank accounts were frozen, and the shell company funds from Vivian were entirely depleted. We had nothing left. The sheer exhaustion of fighting my father's invisible empire threatened to break us. The psychological strain was far worse than the physical cold. My father did not just want to seize the invention. He wanted to break Jack's mind and prove that defying the Harrington dynasty was a fatal error. We sat in the freezing garage, staring at the ruined metal block. Neither of us spoke. There were no tears and no dramatic screams. We were simply hollowed out, drained of every last ounce of adrenaline. Jack eventually urged me to go upstairs and get some sleep, stating he needed to clean up the hazardous chemical foam. I lay on the thin mattress, wrapped in every blanket we owned, but sleep refused to come. In the quiet, freezing hours of the early morning, the silence of the shop below felt unnatural. I climbed out of bed and walked down the metal staircase, expecting to find Jack staring desperately at the scorched manifold. Instead, I found him kneeling in the far corner of the garage beneath the harsh glow of a single droplight. He was not looking at the ruined engine. He was focused on my workspace. Weeks ago, the wooden leg of my heavy drafting table had splintered under the weight of my art portfolios, causing the surface to tilt precariously. I had ignored it, prioritizing our survival over my comfort. Now, in our darkest hour, with his life work destroyed and an eviction looming, Jack was quietly repairing my desk. He had cut a fresh brace from scrap steel and was meticulously bolting it to the damaged wood, securing my foundation. He was covered in black soot, his hands bruised and trembling from fatigue. Yet his priority was fixing the one thing that belonged entirely to me. My father threw away my future to protect his wealth. Jack ignored his ruined future to protect my art. That silent action spoke louder than any grand romantic declaration. I walked across the cold concrete floor and knelt beside him. I did not offer empty words of comfort. I simply reached into the open toolbox, picked up a half-inch socket wrench, and handed it to him. I placed my hand on the steel brace holding it steady while he tightened the bolts. In that quiet, shared labor, our bond hardened into something unbreakable. The psychological fog lifted. We were not victims waiting for an execution. We were architects preparing a counteroffensive. After the table was secured, we sat on the floor and made a brutal calculation. We needed raw materials for one final flawless build. We needed high-grade titanium seals that would not rupture under extreme thermal loads. We needed cash immediately. I walked upstairs and opened my wooden chest. I bypassed the frozen credit cards and pulled out a small velvet box. Inside rested a vintage platinum and diamond watch. It was a gift from my late grandmother, given to me long before the trust fund restrictions applied. It was the only asset my father could not legally track or freeze. Jack walked over to his primary tool chest. He pulled out a heavy wooden case containing a pristine set of precision micrometers and antique measuring calipers. They had belonged to his grandfather. They were his most prized possessions, the tools that taught him how to read the soul of a machine. We packed the items and drove through the snow to a gritty pawn shop on the outskirts of 8 Mile Road. The broker behind the thick, bulletproof glass examined the watch and the antique tools with a critical eye. He offered us a fraction of their true value. We did not negotiate. We took the thick stack of worn $100 bills and drove straight to an industrial supply warehouse. We purchased the titanium seals, the raw aerospace aluminum, and the specific thermal sensors required to rebuild the manifold from scratch. Returning to the garage, the countdown clock was deafening. We had 48 hours until the county sheriff arrived to enforce the eviction and lock the bay doors. Jack drank black coffee and immediately began machining the new block. I assisted him, measuring the tolerances and logging the data to ensure every single specification was perfect. We were gambling our entire existence on this final prototype. But building the engine was only the first step. We needed a battlefield where my father could not silence us. The annual Detroit Auto Show was opening that very weekend at the Downtown Convention Center. It was the absolute epicenter of the American automotive industry, attracting global investors, corporate titans, and independent billionaires. If we could secure a space on that exhibition floor, we could bypass the local venture capitalists who were terrified of angering the Harrington family. We could present the manifold directly to the titans of the industry. Securing a booth at the most prestigious automotive event in the country required corporate credentials, advanced booking, and exorbitant registration fees. We had none of those things. The exhibition was dominated by legacy manufacturers and flashy tech firms, including Apex Motors. Walking into that convention center meant stepping directly into the lion's den. My father would undoubtedly be there, hosting wealthy investors and celebrating his impending victory over us. We had a finished prototype, but getting it past the velvet ropes and onto the showroom floor before the eviction notice took effect would require a masterstroke of deception and sheer, unadulterated audacity. The sprawling expanse of the downtown Detroit Convention Center was a labyrinth of sensory overload. The annual auto show drew thousands of industry insiders, venture capitalists, and automotive journalists from across the globe. The air smelled of polished floor wax, ozone from laser light displays, and the fresh leather interiors of luxury concept vehicles. Walking onto the exhibition floor felt like stepping onto a hostile alien planet. We were running on sheer adrenaline and the bitter dregs of pawn shop cash. Vivian had called in a desperate favor with an event coordinator to secure us a last-minute cancellation spot. Our assigned location was far from the glamorous central atrium. We were placed in a dark, narrow corridor near the freight elevators and the loading docks. It was the kind of spot reserved for obscure vendors and doomed startups. Surrounding us were sprawling, multi-level pavilions funded by legacy manufacturers. They featured rotating platforms, flashing neon signs, and thumping electronic music designed to overwhelm the senses. Across the main aisle stood the Apex Motors Pavilion. It was a monument to corporate vanity, built with pristine white flooring and glowing blue accents. This was the moment my background in visual branding became our greatest weapon. I knew that trying to compete with their noise on a microscopic budget was a guaranteed failure. When everyone else is screaming, the only way to command attention is to whisper. I decided to turn our gloomy, forgotten corner into a magnetic focal point. We draped the 3 temporary walls of our tiny booth in heavy matte black canvas, absorbing all ambient light. I removed every single piece of promotional clutter from the table. There were no glossy brochures, no digital tablets, and no branded merchandise. Instead, I placed the raw machined titanium and aluminum manifold on a dark oxidized iron pedestal right in the center of the space. I angled a single harsh halogen spotlight directly down onto the metal. The effect was arresting. Under that solitary beam of light, the prototype looked less like a mechanical component and more like a brutal, enduring piece of modern art. It showcased the meticulous craftsmanship, the precision of the thermal seals, and the unforgiving reality of its purpose. Jack stood beside the pedestal, wearing clean but worn denim and a dark shirt. The permanent grease worked into the creases of his knuckles perfectly complemented the authentic, gritty aesthetic of our display. We were not selling a shiny illusion. We were presenting raw, undeniable truth. The contrast between our booth and the Apex Motors display across the hall was glaring. At the Apex Pavilion, executives in silk ties mingled with wealthy investors. Waiters in crisp uniforms circulated carrying silver trays loaded with fragile, pristine champagne flutes. Standing at the epicenter of that corporate theater was my father, Richard. He held a delicate crystal glass, gesturing broadly as he charmed a group of foreign buyers. He surrounded himself with things that shattered easily. He built his empire on perception manipulation and fragile alliances. Jack stood beside cold, enduring steel. He forged his worth in fire and friction. The symbolism was heavy and profound. My father was a brittle facade, while the man I married was unbreakable. Eventually, the crowd shifted, and my father's gaze landed on our dark corner. I watched the color drain from his face for a fraction of a second. He had orchestrated the eviction notice, assuming we were shivering in a locked garage waiting for the sheriff. Seeing us standing on the premier exhibition floor of the American automotive industry was a direct defiance he had not anticipated. His shock quickly morphed into a cold, calculating fury. He whispered a sharp command to his entourage of sycophants. The group broke away from the Apex Pavilion and strolled across the main aisle toward us. My father stepped into our shadowed booth, bringing with him the cloying scent of expensive cologne and unearned arrogance. He looked at the heavy canvas walls, the bare iron pedestal, and finally the titanium manifold. He offered a chilling, mocking smile that did not reach his eyes. "Amateur hour," he remarked, his voice pitched loud enough to ensure the passing crowds could hear. It is truly tragic to see scrap metal displayed at a premier industry event. You should have stayed in your freezing shed, Adelaide. You are embarrassing yourself on a public stage. Jack did not flinch. His jaw clenched and the muscles in his neck pulled tight, but his posture remained perfectly relaxed. He kept his hands resting lightly on the cold steel of the prototype, refusing to take the bait. He looked my father dead in the eye and spoke in a low, steady tone. "Real innovation does not need a laser light show to function, Richard. It just needs to work." My father chuckled, taking a slow sip of his champagne. He tapped the fragile rim of his crystal glass against his heavy gold signet ring, producing a sharp, delicate ping. "Keep telling yourself that, grease monkey," he sneered. "In 48 hours, the bank will own that scrap metal, and you will be back to changing oil in the gutter." He turned his back on us and walked away, laughing loudly with his executives. While my father was busy performing for his audience, I was quietly working in the shadows. I held my phone down by my side, the camera lens angled perfectly through the darkness. I had recorded the entire interaction. I captured his mocking tone, his specific dismissal of our technology, and his sheer corporate hubris. I was building a comprehensive digital record of his arrogance, adding it to a growing file. Every time he opened his mouth, he handed me another weapon for the inevitable reckoning. The afternoon dragged on, testing our endurance. The clock in my mind ticked relentlessly, counting down the final 36 hours before the eviction notice became a legal mandate. We watched hundreds of people walk past our booth. Some slowed down, intrigued by the stark lighting, but most hurried onward, drawn by the free liquor and the flashing screens of the legacy brands. Doubt began to creep into the edges of my mind. Had we gambled our last dollar on a ghost town? Then the atmosphere in the aisle subtly shifted. The loud chatter of the crowd seemed to dampen. People parted not for a screaming celebrity or a flashy corporate CEO, but for a solitary figure who carried a very different kind of gravity. An older man wearing a faded canvas jacket over a simple button-down shirt was walking down the corridor. He ignored the neon signs. He ignored the champagne. He was staring directly at the exposed titanium seals resting under our halogen spotlight, and his arrival was about to alter the trajectory of our entire lives. The man walking down the crowded aisle did not fit into the polished aesthetic of the Detroit Auto Show. While the surrounding attendees wore tailored silk suits and expensive Italian leather shoes, this solitary figure wore a faded canvas work jacket and scuffed steel-toed boots. He moved with a slow, deliberate gait, ignoring the flashing neon displays and the pulsing electronic music pouring from the corporate pavilions. The junior executive standing near the Apex Motors booth tried to hand him glossy promotional flyers and crystal flutes of champagne, but he walked right past them without breaking his stride. They dismissed him as a lost maintenance worker. They lacked the historical knowledge to recognize the living ghost of Michigan industrial royalty. I recognized him instantly. My years working in high-end visual branding required me to study the faces of the true power players in the region. The man approaching our shadowed corner was Elias Thorne. He was a notorious recluse and an independent billionaire who had built Thorne Industries into a global manufacturing titan. Unlike my father, who inherited real estate and manipulated paper assets, Elias started his empire 60 years ago with a single wrench and a dirt floor garage. He was the authentic, gritty soul of Detroit history. He despised high society galas, refused interviews, and rarely made public appearances. Seeing him walking the floor of the convention center was a profound anomaly. Elias bypassed the bright lights of the legacy manufacturers and stepped into the dim boundary of our matte black booth. He did not look at me, and he did not look at Jack. His pale, sharp eyes locked directly onto the raw titanium block resting under the single halogen spotlight. He stepped closer, leaning over the oxidized iron pedestal. He did not ask for a digital tablet to view the rendering, and he did not request a marketing brochure. He simply stared at the exposed injection manifold, studying the complex geometry of the thermal channels and the aerospace-grade seals we had purchased just days prior. The silence in our tiny booth stretched out, creating a heavy bubble of tension amid the surrounding convention noise. Jack stood perfectly still. He did not launch into a desperate sales pitch. He did not try to impress the billionaire with corporate buzzwords or frantic energy. Jack possessed the quiet dignity of a man who knew the true value of his own labor. He allowed Elias the time and the space to read the steel. After several long minutes, Elias stood up straight and crossed his arms over his canvas jacket. His voice, when he finally spoke, was gravelly and deep, carrying the rasp of countless hours spent inhaling welding smoke. He pointed a calloused finger at the right side of the prototype. He asked a highly technical question regarding the heat displacement quotient when the primary combustion chamber exceeded optimal thermal thresholds. It was the exact flaw that plagued every major hybrid transition project in the market. It was the puzzle the highly paid engineers at Apex Motors had failed to solve. Jack answered without a single second of hesitation. He explained the proprietary bypass valve system he had designed, detailing how the titanium alloy cooling channels redirected the synthetic load to prevent seal degradation. He did not speak like a subordinate trying to secure a job. He spoke like an equal, discussing a shared passion. The initial question sparked an intense technical debate that lasted for an entire hour. The two men dove into the complex mathematics of fluid dynamics, structural integrity, and thermodynamic pressure distribution. I stood near the edge of the booth, watching the interaction unfold. The deafening roar of the convention center seemed to fade into the background. Jack was standing toe-to-toe with one of the most powerful industrialists in the world, and Elias was hanging on his every word. The billionaire challenged Jack's theories, probing for weaknesses, and Jack fired back with undeniable empirical data, defending his design with fierce intelligence. I kept a careful watch on the main aisle, ensuring no one interrupted them. Across the hall, the atmosphere at the Apex Motors Pavilion was beginning to shift. My father was still holding his champagne glass, but he was no longer laughing with his investors. He was staring directly at our booth. He had finally recognized the man in the faded canvas jacket. I could see the sudden realization strike my father from 50 feet away. The smug arrogance drained from his face, replaced by a stark, visceral panic. He realized that the grease monkey he had mocked was currently holding a private audience with the only man in Detroit who possessed enough capital and independence to crush the Harrington Empire. Inside our booth, the intense debate finally reached a natural conclusion. Elias leaned back and let out a low, resonant laugh. A genuine, warm smile broke across his weathered face, erasing decades of stern corporate stoicism. He looked at Jack with a profound sense of respect. He glanced down at Jack's hands, noticing the dark, permanent stains of engine grease worked deep into the skin. Elias slowly turned his own hands over, revealing the exact same scars, the same calluses, and the same indelible marks of a life spent building things that endure. A silent, powerful acknowledgement passed between the two men, bridging the gap between a billionaire and a mechanic. Elias then turned his sharp gaze toward me. He studied the heavy black canvas walls, the stark lighting, and the deliberate absence of superficial marketing clutter. He recognized the strategic intelligence required to strip away the noise and let the engineering speak for itself. He saw the protective barrier I had built around my husband. He offered me a slow, respectful nod, acknowledging the silent partnership that had brought this prototype to life. Reaching into the breast pocket of his worn jacket, Elias did not pull out a gold-embossed card holder. He produced a single, plain paper business card with frayed edges. He handed it directly to Jack. There was no corporate logo or fancy title printed on the card. It contained nothing but a name and a direct 10-digit cell phone number. The corporate suits missed the latency flaw in electric vehicle transitions, Elias said, his voice low and steady. You did not. Call me tomorrow. He turned and walked away, disappearing back into the sea of tailored suits and flashing lights. He left behind a profound stillness in our dark corner of the convention center. Jack looked down at the scuffed piece of paper in his hand. A fierce surge of hope flooded my chest, pushing back the exhaustion and the lingering fear of the eviction notice. For the first time in 6 months, the crushing weight of my father's invisible net felt like it was beginning to tear. We had found the key to our salvation. But the moment of triumph was fleeting. I looked back across the aisle toward the Apex Pavilion. My father had dropped his crystal champagne flute. The fragile glass shattered on the pristine white flooring, scattering sharp shards across the pavilion. He was ignoring his wealthy guests, staring at us with pure, unchecked terror. He pulled his mobile phone from his tailored pocket and began typing frantically. The hope in my chest hardened into a cold, sharp anticipation. The rules of engagement had just changed. My father knew he could no longer rely on the slow process of a commercial eviction to steal the manifold. Elias Thorne had validated the technology, and my father was now terrified of losing a billion-dollar industry shift. A desperate man with vast resources is the most dangerous kind of enemy. The clock was still ticking down on our final 36 hours, and I knew my father was about to unleash the full, devastating force of his legal machinery to stop us from ever making that phone call. The convention center lights began to dim, signaling the end of the automotive exhibition. Word of Elias Thorne visiting our isolated booth spread through the cavernous hall like a spark dropped into dry brush. In the tight-knit ecosystem of the Detroit automotive industry, secrets are a physical impossibility. When a notorious independent titan spends an entire hour debating thermodynamics with an unknown mechanic, the shadow bidding war ignites before the sun even sets. Corporate spies, masquerading as journalists, lingered near our perimeter, trying to catch a glimpse of the titanium block. We did not give them the chance. We packed the prototype into a reinforced transit case, locked the heavy steel latches, and carried it out to the loading dock. My hands shook slightly, not from the biting winter wind, but from the sheer adrenaline coursing through my veins. We drove back to the industrial district in Jack's battered pickup truck, navigating streets slick with fresh black ice. The digital clock on the dashboard served as a grim reminder of our reality. We had less than 24 hours remaining on the eviction notice. Our singular goal was to clear out every essential tool, every blueprint, and the prototype itself before the county sheriff arrived to bolt the bay doors shut. The morning sun had barely crested the grim silhouette of the downtown factories when we began dismantling the shop. Jack moved with practiced efficiency, taking apart the heavy steel workbench where he had spent countless sleepless nights. He wrapped his late grandfather's antique micrometers in oiled cloth, placing them carefully into a protective iron box. His grandfather had spent 4 decades on an assembly line, never owning the fruits of his own exhausting labor. Jack carried that generational weight on his shoulders, determined to break the cycle. He was physically depleted, but a new, distinct light shone in his eyes. The scuffed paper business card from Elias Thorne rested securely in his front pocket. That 10-digit phone number represented the ultimate validation of his genius and our ticket to permanent freedom. But my father was not a man who surrendered his power to fate. He operated on a foundation of total control and relentless retaliation. The sound of tires crunching over the frozen gravel in our parking lot interrupted the rhythm of our packing. It was not the local sheriff arriving early. A sleek, unmarked black sedan rolled to a stop near the open bay door. A man wearing a plain gray trench coat stepped out of the vehicle. He did not glance around at the rundown neighborhood or the rusted scrap metal piled near the fence. He walked with the brisk, detached purpose of a seasoned legal courier. He approached the threshold, called out Jack's full legal name, and handed over a thick manila envelope sealed with red, tamper-evident tape. Jack took the heavy package. The courier turned on his heel, walked back to his idling car, and drove away without uttering another syllable. Jack stood in the freezing draft, staring at the return address printed in the upper left corner. It bore the crest of the most ruthless corporate litigation firm in the state of Michigan. They were my father's personal attack dogs, a firm famous for burying independent inventors under mountains of unpayable legal fees. Jack ripped the thick paper open, pulling out a dense stack of legal filings. The document resting on top was an emergency injunction granted by a friendly county judge mere hours ago. As Jack read the dense legal paragraphs, the color drained entirely from his face. The spark of hope ignited by Elias Thorne was extinguished in a single, shallow breath. The injunction was a masterclass in dirty corporate warfare. Apex Motors was officially suing Jack for intellectual property theft. The lawsuit spun a brazen, devastating lie. It claimed that during their initial meeting, David Cole had shared confidential proprietary designs with Jack under the guise of a potential partnership. The filing accused my husband of stealing those corporate trade secrets to build the titanium manifold we had just displayed at the auto show. The trap was diabolical in its simplicity. By framing the interaction as corporate espionage, my father leveraged the local legal system to instantly freeze the prototype. The injunction mandated an immediate halt to any sale, transfer, marketing, or discussion of the disputed technology. If Jack attempted to call Elias Thorne and negotiate a buyout, he would be held in contempt of court, facing federal prison time and staggering fines. This was how a billionaire fought his battles. My father did not need to win the lawsuit on its actual merits. He only needed to weaponize the legal process to paralyze us. A firm of that size could drag the discovery phase out for half a decade, demanding endless depositions and irrelevant technical audits. My father knew we were broke. He engineered a scenario where sheer bankruptcy would force Jack to forfeit the patent long before a judge ever heard the truth in a courtroom. The heavy steel transit case containing the manifold sat on the concrete floor between us. Jack looked down at it, and his broad shoulders slumped. He leaned his weight against the half-dismantled workbench, exhaling a long, ragged sigh. The disparity of our resources finally felt insurmountable. We were two exhausted people trying to outrun a financial empire that owned the buildings, the banks, and apparently the courts. Jack dropped the legal papers onto the cold concrete. He looked at me, his eyes filled with a quiet, heartbreaking resignation. He whispered that maybe we had fought too hard and flown too close to the sun. He suggested that fighting a man who could rewrite reality with a signature was a battle we were destined to lose. I did not share his despair. I walked over to the fallen papers and picked up the thick stack of injunction filings. I read the specific allegations, the sworn affidavits from David Cole, and the signature of the lead litigator. The cold draft whipping through the open bay door no longer bothered me. A strange, profound calm settled over my mind, sharpening my focus. I looked down at the fabricated claims, and a slow, cold smile formed on my lips. Jack stared at me, deeply confused by my reaction. He asked how I could possibly smile when my father had just locked our entire future inside a legal vault. I set the papers down on the transit case and smoothed the wrinkled edges. My father was a brilliant real estate mogul, but his arrogance always blinded him to his own vulnerabilities. He was so accustomed to wielding his wealth as a blunt instrument that he forgot how precision could dismantle a sledgehammer. My background in art direction had trained me to look for the invisible structures beneath the surface, to find the negative space where the true story lived. I turned to Jack and explained the fatal flaw in my father's grand strategy. For months, Richard had operated in the shadows. He used proxy buyers, shell companies, and anonymous real estate trusts to hide his involvement. He tried to evict us quietly to avoid leaving fingerprints. He sent Apex Motors to buy the patent quietly. But the sudden presence of Elias Thorne had triggered a profound panic. My father was so terrified of losing a global technological shift to the son-in-law he discarded that he abandoned his careful covert tactics. By filing this specific injunction, my father had officially and legally tied his own corporate machine to the Apex Motors extortion attempt. He had directed his personal legal team to sign their names to a sworn document claiming Jack stole from a company my father secretly controlled. He had stepped out of the shadows and directly onto the illuminated battlefield. I told Jack that a trap only works if the prey steps onto the trigger. My father thought he was burying us under red tape. In reality, he had just overplayed his hand, committing documented perjury in his desperate rush to secure the patent. He had walked blindly into the exact snare I had been preparing since the day he demanded my credit cards. The fear in the garage evaporated, replaced by a chilling, focused energy. We did not need to run anymore. We just needed to close the jaws of the trap. I left Jack at the shop sorting through the dismantled workbench and drove my battered sedan across the icy city streets. The heater in my car was broken, forcing me to grip the steering wheel with numb fingers. My destination was a subterranean parking structure beneath a defunct shopping plaza on the northern edge of Detroit. It was a brutalist concrete cavern, devoid of security cameras and cellular reception. This was the rendezvous point Vivian had chosen when she texted me an urgent, cryptic location ping just moments after the legal courier departed. Vivian operated a highly successful public relations firm catering to the affluent, but her true strength lay in her ability to camouflage her intentions. Growing up as a marginalized outsider in the elite country clubs gave her a unique vantage point. People like my father treated her as a secondary character, an accessory to their own prestige. They assumed her quiet presence was a silent endorsement of their behavior. They never realized she was meticulously observing every weakness, logging every arrogant boast, and mapping the fault lines of their brittle empires. Her sleek, black sport utility vehicle sat idling in the darkest corner of the third sublevel. I pulled up beside her vehicle, shut off my engine, and climbed into her passenger seat. The heater was running full blast, thawing the ice on my jacket. Vivian did not offer a cheerful greeting. Her expression was solemn and sharp, a stark contrast to the warm relative who had delivered groceries weeks prior. She reached into her tailored designer coat, pulled out a small silver digital storage drive, and rested it on the leather center console between us. She explained that cutting ties with my family after my exile would have been a tactical error. Instead, she maintained her membership at the Grosse Pointe Elite Country Club. She continued attending their lavish dinners and charity auctions, acting as a silent sponge, absorbing the toxic gossip. Last night, while Jack and I were defending our prototype against my father's verbal assaults at the convention center, Vivian was sitting 2 tables away from my father in the private dining room of the golf club. My father was celebrating early. The rumor of Elias Thorne visiting our display had reached the suburbs like wildfire. But rather than showing fear, my father chose to project supreme confidence. He ordered expensive vintage scotch and gathered his loyal sycophants around a roaring limestone fireplace. Intoxicated by his own perceived invincibility and the expensive liquor, he began to brag. He needed his peers to know that the billionaire threat was already neutralized by his superior intellect. Vivian pressed a button on the dashboard interface, syncing the small silver drive to the vehicle sound system. The interior filled with the ambient noise of clinking crystal glasses and low murmurs. Then my father's voice cut through the static. His tone was slurred but unmistakably arrogant. I sat in the heated leather seat and listened as the man who raised me freely confessed to a litany of federal crimes. He laughed about the Apex Motors lawsuit, calling it a brilliant piece of fiction. He openly admitted that David Cole never shared any proprietary designs with Jack. My father boasted about orchestrating the entire encounter specifically to lay the groundwork for a false intellectual property claim. He detailed his strategy to buy the commercial mortgage and use the landlord's lien to steal the physical prototype right out of the garage. He told his wealthy friends that a mechanic and an ungrateful daughter were no match for a titan who could afford to buy the local judiciary and bury the truth under a mountain of paperwork. Hearing his words spoken with such casual cruelty did not break my heart. It solidified my resolve, turning my sorrow into a cold, weaponized focus. The audio was pristine. It was a flawless, unassailable confession to extortion, perjury, and corporate fraud. Vivian had sat in that dining room sipping her sparkling water while quietly recording the entire monologue on a high-fidelity device concealed in her clutch purse. She was the double agent who finally cracked the Harrington armor from the inside. I thanked Vivian, grasping her hands in the dim light of the parking garage. We shared a look of profound mutual respect, acknowledging the immense risk she had taken to secure our freedom. I took the silver drive and drove straight back to the surface, searching for a strong cellular signal. I pulled into a vacant lot near the highway and pulled out the scuffed paper business card Elias Thorne had handed to Jack. I dialed the 10-digit number. It rang only twice before the deep, gravelly voice answered. I did not waste his time with pleasantries or desperate pleas. I introduced myself and explained the emergency injunction my father had just filed. I outlined how the lawsuit was a fabricated barrier designed to prevent Thorne Industries from examining the manifold. Then I told him I possessed undeniable, time-stamped audio proof of the extortion plot, detailing my father's exact words. Elias Thorne was a man who valued integrity and raw, honest labor above all else. He despised the Wall Street tactics of manipulation and endless litigation used by men who never built anything with their own hands. His response was brief and chillingly calm. He instructed me to transmit the encrypted audio file to a specific, secure email address belonging to his personal general counsel. He told me to stay in the garage and let him handle the pest control. The retaliation was swift and surgical. I sent the file from my secure mobile connection and drove back to the repair shop. Jack was leaning against the steel beams, waiting for my return. I explained everything Vivian had provided and the subsequent phone call. We waited in the freezing shop, staring at our phones, the tension heavy in the air. We did not have to wait long. Less than 3 hours after the courier delivered the initial injunction, a different email arrived in my inbox. It was a formal notification from the county clerk. The elite law firm representing Apex Motors and my father had abruptly withdrawn the injunction with prejudice. They abandoned the lawsuit entirely, retreating in absolute terror. Elias Thorne had unleashed his own corporate lawyers. They did not file a countersuit or engage in a public media war. They simply sent a copy of the audio recording directly to the senior partners of my father's law firm, along with a polite reminder of the severe federal penalties for knowingly submitting perjured affidavits to a judge. The threat of a sweeping federal racketeering investigation was enough to make the most ruthless litigators in Detroit drop my father as a client within minutes. They severed all ties, leaving him legally defenseless and utterly exposed. The legal snare that was supposed to freeze our assets for years evaporated into thin air. The battlefield was cleared not by a lengthy trial, but by the sheer weight of undeniable truth wielded by a superior force. The profound dramatic irony hung in the frigid air of the garage. My father's relentless obsession with his own superiority, his desperate need to brag and project dominance, was the exact weapon I used to dismantle his attack. He handed us the key to our own cage because his ego could not tolerate silence. Jack and I were finally free from the invisible net. We loaded the transit case containing the titanium manifold into the back of the truck, preparing to drive to the Thorne Industries headquarters for the official valuation. But taking a billionaire industrialist up on an offer is never a simple transaction. Walking into that boardroom meant laying bare the true potential of Jack's genius and bracing for a financial outcome that would permanently alter our reality. We had won the skirmish, but the impending sale was about to trigger a societal shockwave that would shake the Grosse Pointe elite to their very foundation, forcing my parents into a corner. And cornered predators do not surrender. They reinvent their delusions. The drive to the Thorne Industries headquarters took us away from the crumbling warehouses of our neighborhood and into the gleaming heart of the corporate district. The building was a towering monolith of dark glass and brushed steel, standing as a silent testament to enduring industrial power. We parked Jack's rusted pickup truck in a subterranean garage filled with imported executive sedans. He pulled the heavy transit case from the truck bed. We walked toward the private elevator banks side by side. My heart beat with a steady, rhythmic drum, but the lingering fear of the past 6 months was gone. We were no longer fighting for survival. We were walking into a coronation. The elevator doors opened onto the penthouse level, revealing a sprawling boardroom that offered a panoramic view of the Detroit skyline. The contrast between this room and my parents' dining room in Grosse Pointe was profound and deliberate. My parents surrounded themselves with fragile crystal, delicate porcelain, and an atmosphere of inherited prestige. Their dining room was designed to intimidate outsiders and enforce rigid class boundaries. The Thorne boardroom was designed for pure function. The long table was carved from solid mahogany, bearing the faint scratches of countless heavy blueprints. The men and women gathered around it wore rolled-up sleeves, unbuttoned collars, and expressions of sharp, focused intelligence. They held thick ceramic coffee mugs instead of champagne flutes. In this room, competence was worshipped, far above arbitrary pedigree. Elias Thorne sat at the head of the table. He gestured for us to sit opposite him. To his right sat his chief engineer, a woman with silver hair and safety glasses resting atop her head. She did not bother with pleasantries. She opened a thick technical dossier and looked directly at Jack. Her eyes held a mixture of professional skepticism and undeniable awe. She explained that her team had subjected the prototype to 72 consecutive hours of extreme thermal load testing in their advanced simulation chambers. The aerospace-grade seals held firm. The proprietary cooling channels redirected the synthetic load exactly as Jack had theorized. She told the room that the injection manifold would resolve the thermal latency flaw currently bottlenecking the entire hybrid vehicle market. The design was elegant, simple, and infinitely scalable. It would save Thorne Industries billions of dollars in manufacturing costs and warranty replacements over the next decade. She closed the dossier and nodded respectfully toward Jack. It was a silent acknowledgement from a highly credentialed expert to a man who had learned his trade on a cold concrete floor. The corporate engineers possessed elite degrees, but they suffered from textbook tunnel vision. They were trained to solve problems within established parameters. Jack possessed a different kind of vision. He learned by listening to the rhythm of broken engines, understanding how heat and friction interacted in the real world. That practical, grinding experience had allowed him to see the solution they missed. Elias dismissed the engineering team, leaving only his general counsel remaining in the room. The atmosphere shifted from technical analysis to high-stakes business. The billionaire steepled his calloused fingers, looking at us with a quiet, assessing gaze. He mentioned the swift dismantling of the injunction, noting that a man who fabricates lawsuits is a man who builds on quicksand. Elias respected the cold efficiency we used to clear the battlefield. He did not view us as desperate targets. He viewed us as formidable peers. He reached out and slid a single, heavy manila folder across the polished mahogany. It stopped directly in front of Jack. Elias stated that he did not want to license the technology or enter a convoluted royalty partnership. He wanted to buy the patent outright, securing exclusive global rights for Thorne Industries. He told Jack to open the folder and review the initial offer. Jack flipped the thick cover open. I looked down at the crisp legal document illuminated by the natural light streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows. There were no confusing perpetuity clauses or hidden traps. There was only a clean, straightforward acquisition contract and a single figure printed in bold black ink. 80, followed by 6 more zeros. $80 million. The room fell into a deep, heavy silence. I stared at the numbers, tracing the journey that brought us to this exact second. We had frozen in an unheated apartment. We had survived on cheap ramen. We had pawned heirloom jewelry just to buy scrap metal. My father had tried to erase our existence to prove a cruel point about class and submission. Yet here we sat looking at a sum of money that dwarfed my original trust fund. Jack did not cheer. He did not pump his fist or break into a triumphant smile. The sheer gravity of the moment seemed to press down on his shoulders. He was thinking about his late grandfather, who spent 40 grueling years on a local assembly line, sacrificing his body for a pension that barely covered basic medical bills. Jack knew that working-class men were conditioned to expect pennies for their sweat. Looking at $80 million required a fundamental rewiring of his reality. He reached under the heavy wooden table and found my hand. His fingers wrapped around mine, gripping tightly. The heat and rough texture of his skin grounded him, anchoring him to the present moment. He drew a slow, deep breath, letting the silence stretch out a few seconds longer. When Jack finally looked up, his expression was resolute. He looked directly into the sharp, pale eyes of Elias Thorne. Jack did not ask for a higher sum. He did not demand a board seat or a vanity title. He pushed the folder back slightly and stated his single, non-negotiable condition. He demanded a legally binding clause guaranteeing that the primary manufacturing facilities for the new manifold must be located strictly within the city limits of Detroit. Jack explained that the invention was born in the shadows of the city. He wanted the production lines to employ the local mechanics, the line workers, and the gritty laborers who were routinely discarded by the corporate elite. He refused to let the technology be shipped overseas to maximize profit margins. If Thorne Industries wanted the patent, they had to invest in the people who built the foundation of the industry. The general counsel shifted uncomfortably in his leather chair, preparing to argue the logistical costs of domestic manufacturing. Elias raised a single hand, silencing the attorney instantly. The billionaire leaned forward, a wide, genuine smile breaking across his weathered face. He looked at Jack with profound respect. Elias understood the value of loyalty to one's roots because he shared the exact same origin story. "Written in ink," son Elias said, his gravelly voice echoing with finality. The attorney swiftly drafted the addendum and printed the revised signature pages. Jack picked up a heavy silver pen. He signed his name with firm, steady strokes, transferring the rights of his life work. I signed beneath him as the official witness and foundational partner of the new enterprise. The scratching sound of the pen against the thick paper felt like the breaking of chains. In a single signature, the ridiculed mechanic and the exiled daughter secured a permanent, undeniable dynasty of their own. We shook hands with Elias and walked out of the penthouse Ford room. The elevator doors closed, carrying us back down to the ground floor. We stepped out of the glass building into the crisp winter air, no longer hunted and no longer poor. We possessed an astronomical fortune and the unbreakable bond forged in the crucible of my father's cruelty. But gaining immense power means altering the gravity around you. The ink on the contract was already drying, and the acquisition filing would hit the financial newswires before sunrise. The realization struck me with cold clarity. Grosse Pointe was about to wake up to a societal earthquake. Wealth is the only language my parents truly understood, and we now spoke it fluently. I knew Richard and Evelyn would not reflect on their actions or offer a genuine apology. Narcissists do not seek redemption. They seek proximity to power. As we drove away from the corporate district, my phone sat silently in my pocket, but I knew the peace would not last. The narrative was about to flip, and the frantic scramble of the elite to rewrite history would present a brand new, insidious challenge. The ink on the acquisition documents had barely dried before Thorne Industries issued the official press release. Financial news travels through the modern digital ecosystem with staggering velocity. By dawn the following morning, the headline glared across every major economic terminal from Wall Street to Tokyo. Unknown Detroit mechanic secures $80 million patent buyout. The subtext detailed a revolutionary thermodynamic injection manifold acquired by Elias Thorne, bypassing the traditional corporate gatekeepers entirely. The societal shockwave struck the manicured enclaves of Grosse Pointe with devastating precision. For 6 months, my parents had carefully curated a narrative of tragedy and betrayal. They told their affluent peers that I had ruined my life for an uneducated laborer. They worshipped traditional pedigrees, viewing mechanics as a subhuman caste meant only to service their luxury vehicles. Now, the very society they sought to impress was reading about the unprecedented triumph of the man they had so publicly discarded. The elite country club circles are notoriously fickle. Loyalty in that world extends only as far as the nearest display of wealth. The gallery owners who canceled my freelance art direction contracts suddenly found themselves holding worthless connections. The socialites who had whispered cruel rumors over morning tennis matches were now frantically scrambling, trying to figure out how to ingratiate themselves with the newest and youngest titans of Detroit industry. The Harrington family had spent decades building their prestige on real estate holdings, but Jack had just eclipsed their entire net worth with a single piece of machined titanium. While the suburban elite reeled from the social upheaval, a much darker crisis was unfolding in the corporate sector. Apex Motors was bleeding. My father, Richard Harrington, had staked a significant portion of his hidden equity on the theft of Jack's intellectual property. When the legal injunction evaporated under the threat of federal extortion charges, the proxy firm was left with a gaping hole in their quarterly projections. Investors were demanding answers about the hybrid technology Apex had promised to deliver. Desperation breeds reckless decisions. In a frantic attempt to save face and stabilize plunging stock prices, my father ordered the Apex engineering team to accelerate their alternative hybrid combustion design. They bypassed crucial safety protocols, rushing a flawed secondary concept to a public technology expo held at the downtown convention center. It was a spectacular display of hubris. Jack and I watched the live broadcast of the expo from a quiet corner booth in a local diner, sipping black coffee. The contrast between our serene morning and the chaotic corporate theater unfolding on the screen was profound. My father stood on a brightly lit stage surrounded by eager automotive journalists and skeptical venture capitalists. He wore his tailored suit, projecting a hollow confidence as he introduced the Apex Alternative Engine. He spoke in broad buzzwords, lacking the fundamental understanding of the machinery he was attempting to sell. The lead engineer engaged the ignition protocol. On the high-definition monitor, the alternative hybrid block roared to life. For the first 30 seconds, the demonstration appeared successful. The assembled crowd murmured with quiet approval. But Jack leaned forward, resting his elbows on the diner table, his eyes locked onto the screen. He tilted his head slightly, listening to the audio feed with the trained ear of a master mechanic. Without the proprietary titanium cooling channels Jack had designed, the Apex engine could not handle the escalating synthetic load. The heat displacement failed exactly as Jack had predicted. Then the sound began. It was faint at first, but quickly amplified through the broadcast microphones. A distinct, rhythmic, metallic ticking beneath the roar of the primary combustion chamber. It was an auditory knock. A cold chill of recognition ran down my spine. It was the exact same misfiring rhythm Jack had diagnosed in my father's vintage Mustang in our driveway 6 months prior. The luxury dealership mechanics had ignored the flaw in the car, and the highly credentialed corporate engineers had ignored the exact thermodynamic vulnerability in their rushed prototype. They had tuned their machine for vanity rather than function. The poetic justice was swift and undeniable. The auditory knock grew louder, transitioning into a violent shudder. The timing belt tensioner within the Apex prototype snapped under the immense, unmitigated heat. A sharp crack echoed through the expo hall, followed instantly by a thick plume of black smoke pouring from the engine casing. Sirens blared as automated fire suppression systems activated, spraying the stage and the panicked executives in a thick layer of chemical foam. The live feed captured my father's face as the prototype destroyed itself in front of the entire industry. His expression was a portrait of total public humiliation. The venture capitalists fled the seating area, covering their faces. Within minutes of the broadcast disaster, Apex Motors stock went into an immediate, catastrophic freefall. The market recognized the failure not just of a machine, but of the leadership behind it. My father had tried to steal a working invention because he lacked the vision to build one himself, and his substitute had just exploded on national television. Jack took a slow sip of his coffee, his expression unreadable. He did not gloat. He simply watched the natural consequence of arrogance play out on the screen. As the news anchors scrambled to contextualize the corporate disaster, my cell phone began to vibrate against the Formica table. The screen illuminated, displaying a familiar incoming caller identification. It was my mother, Victoria. For half a year, that phone had remained silent. When we were freezing in an unheated garage eating cheap noodles and facing eviction, she had never once reached out to offer a warm coat or a kind word. She had only used her voice to spread toxic lies and ensure my professional starvation. Now, faced with our astronomical success and her husband's catastrophic public failure, she was suddenly eager to reconnect. I let the device vibrate until the call rolled over to the automated answering service. A minute later, a notification appeared, signaling a new voice message. I pressed the playback icon, resting the speaker near my ear. My mother's voice flowed through the small speaker, dripping with a sickeningly sweet artificial warmth. "Sweetheart, we miss you so much," she purred, her tone entirely devoid of any genuine remorse. "The news about the buyout is just phenomenal. Your father and I are thrilled. We always knew Jack had immense potential. We were simply testing his resolve to ensure he was strong enough to provide for you. Please call us back, darling. It is time for our family to reunite and celebrate." I sat in the diner booth dissecting the sheer audacity of her words. The psychological manipulation was staggering. Victoria was attempting to entirely rewrite history. She was gaslighting me, trying to frame 6 months of systematic financial starvation, corporate espionage, and relentless social sabotage as a clever parenting strategy. She wanted to claim credit for the $80 million victory, taking a narrative of survival and twisting it into a story of tough love. In the past, that kind of emotional coercion would have sparked a desperate need to argue. I would have called her back, demanding an apology, outlining every cruel action, and pleading for her to acknowledge the truth. I would have handed her the emotional engagement she craved. But the power dynamic had fundamentally inverted. I looked at Jack, sitting across from me, strong, steady, and victorious. I looked at the bank notification on my screen. confirming a deposit that ensured we would never have to ask anyone for permission to exist ever again. I deleted the voice message with a single swipe of my finger. I did not type a furious text reply. I did not call my father's office to gloat over his plunging stock portfolio. I chose the most devastating weapon in my arsenal. I chose deafening silence. Narcissists feed on attention, whether it is positive praise or negative outrage. To be ignored is their ultimate nightmare. By maintaining a cold, unyielding silence, I denied Victoria the opportunity to control the narrative. I left my parents isolated in their crumbling social standing, surrounded by the wreckage of their own making. But a status-obsessed family denied their desired spotlight does not simply retreat into the shadows. When silence deprives them of control, they invent a stage of their own. Their inability to dictate our reality was driving them mad. And that desperation was about to manifest in a spectacularly delusional public gesture, setting the stage for a final, unescapable confrontation. The silence I maintained acted as a vacuum, and my parents rushed to fill that void with their own fabricated reality. To comprehend the depths of my father's delusion, you must understand how a titan of industry reacts when backed into an inescapable corner. The disastrous public failure of the substitute hybrid engine had sent his real estate holding company into a steep dive. Institutional investors were pulling their capital, fearing widespread instability across his varied portfolios. The board of directors convened an emergency session demanding his immediate resignation to stop the financial bleeding. Richard stood at the head of a long, polished mahogany conference table, facing a room full of furious shareholders. He did not offer an apology. A man whose entire identity is forged in unearned superiority cannot admit defeat. Instead, he pivoted effortlessly. He wove an intricate lie to save his crumbling empire. Richard smoothed the lapels of his tailored suit and projected an aura of supreme, unshakable calm. He told the assembled executives that the failed public demonstration was merely a calculated misdirection. He claimed the real innovation, the true technological marvel, was always Jack. My father looked those seasoned financial veterans in the eye and stated that he had covertly funded our entire operation from the very beginning. He framed our 6 months of starvation and extreme poverty as a deliberate, private incubator phase. He spun a narrative where he served as the secret visionary, providing seed money under the radar to shield Jack from corporate espionage and rival tech firms. Richard argued that the $80 million acquisition by Elias Thorne was a mutual victory, orchestrated by his own brilliant foresight. He promised the board that his relationship with his new genius son-in-law would yield unprecedented lucrative partnerships for their own firm, stabilizing their plunging stock. While my father pacified the corporate sector with fiction, my mother mobilized the affluent suburbs. Victoria could not bear the social isolation that accompanied our sudden astronomical wealth. The elite circles of Grosse Pointe respect nothing more than proximity to immense fortune. My mother understood she needed to reclaim her position at the top of the hierarchy before her peers realized she was permanently exiled from our lives. She contacted the local society registry and booked the grand ballroom at the most exclusive country club in the state. She ordered thousands of imported white roses, hired a classical string quartet, and began dispatching engraved notices to the wealthiest families in Michigan. The event was billed as a grand celebration honoring her beloved son-in-law and his historic automotive achievement. She smiled over afternoon teas, weaving a sickening tale of familial devotion. She told her affluent friends that our temporary estrangement was just a harsh, necessary lesson in independence, proving her exceptional parenting skills. This behavior was not a sudden anomaly. Growing up, I watched my father execute similar strategies within the commercial real estate market. He routinely purchased distressed properties developed by struggling independent architects. He would force the original creators into bankruptcy, seize their blueprints through legal loopholes, and unveil the finished projects under his own name. He built his reputation by siphoning the brilliance of those who lacked the resources to defend themselves. He assumed Jack and I were just another set of vulnerable targets. He believed his fabricated story would bind us to his sinking ship. He banked on the assumption that I still craved his paternal approval and would silently accept the false narrative just to be welcomed back into the comfort of the family fold. Jack and I were spending our final afternoon in the downtown repair shop. We had already purchased a secure, state-of-the-art industrial facility across the city, but Jack wanted to personally pack his late grandfather's tools before handing over the keys to the new tenant. The harsh winter wind rattled the corrugated metal walls, a familiar sound that no longer held any power over our future. A bonded courier pulled into the icy parking lot, stepping out of a heated luxury sedan. He handed a rigid square envelope to Jack, requiring a digital signature for delivery. The courier departed, leaving us standing near the cleared steel workbench under the pale fluorescent lights. Jack brought the envelope inside. The paper was unusually thick, heavy cream cardstock bearing a pristine wax seal stamped with the Harrington family crest. He broke the seal and pulled out the contents. The invitation was printed in raised gold lettering. The sheer hypocrisy radiating from the card was a physical weight. The elegant script formally invited the recipient to an evening of champagne and celebration, honoring the unparalleled genius of Jack Sullivan, hosted by his devoted parents, Richard and Victoria. Tucked behind the formal card was a handwritten note from my mother. The cursive handwriting looped with false affection, begging us to come home and take our rightful place at their side to share in the glorious triumph. Jack read the gold letters, his jaw tightening until a muscle ticked near his temple. He looked around the cold, drafty garage. He remembered the long nights his hands bled from working 14-hour shifts just to keep the small space heater running. He remembered the pawn shop, the taste of cheap instant noodles, and the crushing weight of the eviction notice my father had gleefully signed. The working-class men and women of Jack's neighborhood did not play these intricate psychological games. When someone tried to destroy your life, you did not share a toast with them. You cut them out, and you never looked back. Disgust washed over his features, replacing his usual steady, calm demeanor. He crumpled the thick cream cardstock in his calloused hand. He turned toward the metal scrap bin where a small contained fire burned to destroy sensitive leftover shop documents. He raised his arm, preparing to toss the entire delusion directly into the flames. I stepped forward and caught his wrist. My grip was firm, stopping his forward momentum. Jack looked at me, his eyes flashing with a rare, intense frustration. He asked why we should entertain their madness for even a single second. He wanted to leave them to drown in their own lies and walk away into our new life without looking over his shoulder. I gently pried the crumpled invitation from his strong fingers. I smoothed out the heavy cream paper, staring at the gold-embossed letters reflecting the dim garage lighting. I felt no lingering anger. The residual sorrow I once harbored for my parents was entirely gone. In its place was a sharp, clear, glacial resolve. I looked at the man who had sacrificed his physical well-being to protect my dignity. I knew that simply ignoring the gala would allow my father to continue his charade indefinitely. He would stand at that podium unopposed, telling the entire city that he owned Jack's success. He would use our absence as proof of his own benevolent modesty, claiming we were simply too busy engineering the future to attend. I met Jack's gaze. My voice was quiet, but carried the undeniable weight of a final verdict. I told him we were going. I explained that staying away would let them dictate the ending of the story. I told him we were going to walk straight into the heart of their glittering sanctuary. We were not going to drink their champagne or smile for their hired photographers. We were going to look them in the eye and dismantle their empire down to the very foundation in front of every single person they ever sought to impress. Jack studied my face. He saw the strategic calculation, the cold readiness to confront the very monsters who had guarded my childhood. The tension in his broad shoulders released, melting into a profound, steady solidarity. He nodded once, making a silent vow to stand beside me on the precipice. We gathered the final antique tools, locked the heavy steel bay doors, and walked away from the freezing garage for the last time. The stage was meticulously set for a reckoning. My parents were preparing a lavish banquet, expecting a quiet, submissive return. They had no idea they were weaving their own public demise. We were heading into the blinding lights of Grosse Pointe, not as returning exiles, but as the architects of their ultimate downfall. The audience was gathering, eager for a celebration, entirely unaware they were about to witness a slaughter. The grand ballroom of the Grosse Pointe Country Club was a sanctuary of inherited privilege. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over round tables draped in heavy ivory linen. Centerpieces of imported white orchids perfumed the recycled heated air. A classical string quartet played a soft Mozart sonata in a darkened corner, providing a sophisticated acoustic backdrop for the clinking of sterling silver forks against fine porcelain plates. Detroit's upper crust gathered in full force. Corporate titans, venture capitalists, and society matriarchs mingled with prominent financial journalists. They all came eager to witness the resurrection of the Harrington dynasty. My father stood at the polished oak podium situated at the front of the cavernous room. He wore a bespoke midnight blue tuxedo, projecting the image of a benevolent patriarch. Behind him, an enormous digital screen displayed the logos of his real estate holding firm, intertwined with subtle automotive graphics. He tapped a silver spoon against his champagne flute, calling the sprawling room to order. The dull roar of elite networking quieted into an attentive hush. Richard leaned into the microphone, his voice smooth and practiced. He thanked the distinguished guests for attending this historic celebration. He wove his fabricated narrative with terrifying ease. He spoke of foresight and familial duty, claiming he recognized Jack's raw mechanical brilliance from the very first handshake. My father told the captivated audience that the 6 months we spent starving in a freezing industrial garage was actually a covert private incubator funded by his own secret accounts. He framed our isolation as a deliberate strategy to protect the proprietary injection manifold from rival tech firms. He raised his glass, toasting the $80 million buyout as a joint family triumph, a testament to his own visionary leadership. The crowd erupted into polite applause. The financial reporters in the front row typed rapidly on their mobile devices, preparing to dispatch the miraculous turnaround story to the national business wires. My father smiled, soaking in the stolen adulation. He believed his web of lies had successfully stabilized his plunging stock prices and secured his legacy. Then the heavy mahogany double doors at the rear of the ballroom swung open. The heavy brass latch echoed with a sharp click that cut through the fading applause. The string quartet faltered, a single violinist hitting a discordant note before grinding to a halt. Heads turned in unison. The sea of tailored suits and silk evening gowns parted, creating a wide central aisle. Jack and I stood at the threshold. We did not resemble the destitute exiles my parents had banished into the winter storm half a year prior. We did not wear the stain of poverty or the exhaustion of endless labor. We were the physical embodiment of unassailable triumph. Jack wore a flawlessly tailored charcoal tuxedo that accentuated the broad shoulders he built hauling engine blocks. His posture was impeccably straight, exuding a quiet, lethal confidence. He looked like a man who owned the very ground he walked upon. I stood beside him, wearing a floor-length emerald gown that swept the carpet with fluid grace. My chin was high, my gaze focused and unwavering. We walked down the center aisle. The silence in the ballroom deepened, becoming a heavy, suffocating weight. The wealthy patrons who had shunned my art direction agency and whispered cruel rumors now stared at us with wide, unblinking eyes. Gallery owners who had canceled my contracts looked down at their expensive shoes, unable to meet my gaze. The attendees parted nervously, stepping back to give us a wide berth. The atmosphere shifted from celebratory to deeply tense. The audience sensed that we were not walking toward a joyful reunion. We were marching toward an execution. At the podium, the smug smile on my father's face began to fracture. A microscopic bead of sweat broke out along his hairline. He recognized the cold calculation in my eyes, but his narcissism demanded he maintain the facade. He chuckled, nervously adjusting his posture and extending his arms in a wide, welcoming gesture. He spoke into the microphone, projecting false warmth, urging the crowd to welcome the prodigal daughter and the genius engineer back into the fold. We reached the base of the stage. Jack stopped at the first step, planting his feet with the solid, immovable presence of a steel beam. He folded his hands in front of him, his calloused knuckles resting against the fine wool of his suit. He locked his gaze onto my father, stripping away the older man's artificial authority with a single piercing look. I ascended the carpeted stairs alone. My heels clicked softly against the wooden stage, echoing through the quiet room. Richard took a step forward, reaching out to embrace me for the flashing cameras. I smoothly sidestepped his grasp, leaving his arms hanging awkwardly in the empty space. I walked directly to the microphone stand and adjusted the stem downward. I did not yell. Raising my voice would imply a loss of control. I spoke in a quiet, chillingly professional tone that resonated off the crystal chandeliers and reached every corner of the silent ballroom. I addressed the crowd, thanking them for gathering. Then I turned my head slightly, locking eyes with my father. I reached into my emerald evening clutch. My fingers brushed against a familiar, heavy paper square. I pulled it out and held it up under the stage lights. It was a thick, platinum envelope. It was the exact same envelope my father had slid across his dining room table 6 months ago when he demanded my credit cards and banished me to the industrial slums. I held it out toward him. His hand trembled slightly as he took it. He looked down at the embossed platinum surface, the color draining entirely from his face as the memory of his own cruelty crashed into his current reality. I leaned into the microphone. My words were precise and devoid of any emotional hesitation. "This is a formal cease and desist order," I stated the words, ringing out with glacial clarity. "You did not fund this manifold, Richard. You tried to steal it using fraudulent shell companies and dirty legal injunctions. You used your wealth to starve us, hoping we would break. You failed." A collective, audible gasp rippled through the audience. The financial reporters stopped typing, freezing in shock, before their fingers began flying across their keyboards with renewed, frantic energy. The narrative they were about to publish had just inverted from a heartwarming corporate victory into a devastating scandal of perjury and fraud. I kept my gaze locked on my father, watching his empire crumble in the reflection of his panicked eyes. I delivered the final blow, ensuring the terms were public and undeniable. "If you ever use our names to inflate your sinking stock again, Thorne Industries will unleash their legal department. They will dismantle whatever remains of your holding company by the end of the week. Do not ever contact us again." The silence that followed was profound. It was the sound of a dynasty shattering. My father stood frozen at the podium, his mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. He clutched the platinum envelope, his fingers turning white from the strain. He looked out at his peers, his investors, and his society friends, expecting someone to jump to his defense. No one moved. The elite crowd recoiled, recognizing the stench of a ruined man. They were already calculating how quickly they could divest their shares before the markets opened on Monday morning. I stepped away from the microphone, leaving the silence to consume him. I walked back down the carpeted stairs. Jack offered his arm. I took it, feeling the solid, reassuring warmth of his presence. We turned our backs on the stage and walked up the center aisle toward the heavy mahogany doors. The crowd parted for us once more, not out of polite reverence, but out of genuine awe. We left the glittering ballroom behind, stepping out into the crisp winter night air. We had delivered the final judgment, leaving the architect of our suffering trapped in a prison of his own public humiliation. The battle was won, but the aftermath of such a spectacular collapse creates a dangerous vacuum. A new reality was waiting for us outside those doors, one where we held the reins of immense industry power and had to decide exactly what kind of legacy we intended to build from the ashes. The financial markets opened on Monday morning with a swift and brutal verdict. The recorded footage from the Grosse Pointe Country Club Gala had circulated through every digital trading floor overnight. Investors watched my father stand frozen at the podium, clutching the platinum envelope, as the truth stripped away his carefully manufactured facade. The revelation of his perjury and the sudden catastrophic failure of his substitute hybrid prototype created a perfect storm of corporate panic. When the opening bell rang, Apex Motors stock flatlined. The institutional shareholders who had propped up his real estate holding firm initiated a sweeping sell-off to escape the blast radius. By noon, the board of directors convened a mandatory emergency session. They did not invite my father to defend his actions. They drafted a binding resolution forcing Richard Harrington into an immediate, humiliating early retirement. He was stripped of his executive titles, locked out of his own corporate headquarters, and ordered to liquidate his equity to cover the mounting legal liabilities. A man who had spent 4 decades building a dynasty on intimidation and stolen brilliance was dismantled in less than 12 hours. The poetic justice of his downfall did not end with his resignation. My father needed to offload his liquidated shares rapidly to satisfy his aggressive creditors. He accepted a humiliating fraction of their original value from an anonymous purchasing entity. He signed the transfer documents without realizing the identity of the buyer waiting on the other side of the transaction. The entity that purchased the remnants of his empire for pennies on the dollar was a newly formed organization. It was registered under the name the Sullivan Innovators Foundation. We used the very wealth he tried to extort from us to buy the ashes of his legacy. Jack and I did not use our new fortune to retreat to a quiet tropical island or build a sterile mansion in a gated community. We chose to plant our roots deep into the concrete of the city that forged our survival. We purchased a sprawling historic warehouse in the center of downtown Detroit. The building was an architectural relic from the golden age of American manufacturing, featuring soaring skylights, exposed red brick walls, and heavy iron support beams. For decades, it had sat abandoned, a forgotten casualty of economic shifts and corporate neglect. We bought the deed and brought the structure back to life. We poured our capital into transforming the hollow shell into a state-of-the-art grant foundation and industrial incubator. We installed advanced thermodynamics testing laboratories, precision machining equipment, and secure digital design studios. But this facility was not built for Ivy League graduates carrying polished resumes and silver spoons. It was designed specifically for the gritty, brilliant minds operating in the shadows. We opened our doors to the blue-collar mechanics, the local technicians, and the self-taught inventors who possessed calloused hands but lacked traditional academic pedigrees. I stepped into the role of executive director utilizing my background in visual branding and marketing to secure patents and negotiate fair manufacturing contracts for our applicants. I crafted campaigns that highlighted the raw, authentic power of their designs, forcing the corporate world to respect the innovators they typically ignored. Jack served as the chief technical advisor, walking the shop floor every day in his familiar canvas coveralls. He mentored young men and women who reminded him of his late grandfather, teaching them how to read the friction in a gear and how to protect the intellectual property they created. Our foundation provided full financial grants, legal protection, and a secure physical space for these inventors to build their prototypes without the fear of eviction or corporate theft. We created an ecosystem where talent was the only currency that mattered. We removed the invisible barriers that men like my father had constructed to keep the working class submissive. Every time a new patent was filed under the Sullivan name, we proved that true genius does not require permission from the elite to change the world. The city of Detroit responded to our initiative with a fierce, protective loyalty. The local neighborhoods recognized that we were not gentrifying their streets for a quick profit. We were investing in their sons and their daughters. The same community that had watched us struggle through a freezing winter now stood as a formidable shield around our new enterprise. The industrial district buzzed with renewed energy. Delivery trucks arrived daily carrying high-grade aerospace aluminum, titanium alloy components, and precision diagnostic sensors. The air around the warehouse smelled of fresh asphalt, melting metal, and the distinct, sharp scent of progress. We hired Vivian to manage our public relations and community outreach. She expertly navigated the complex media landscape, ensuring our foundation remained focused on the innovators rather than the spectacle of our newfound wealth. She shielded our mechanics from predatory venture capitalists and crafted a narrative that celebrated the authentic grit of Michigan history. Working alongside my brilliant cousin felt like a daily vindication. We had both rejected the toxic expectations of the elite suburbs, choosing instead to build our own tables on our own terms. While our daily lives flourished, the silence from the Harrington estate remained a testament to their isolation. They had retreated behind their wrought iron gates, hiding from the societal scorn they had once wielded as a weapon. The country club peers who used to attend my mother's lavish luncheons now crossed the street to avoid her gaze. They were terrified of being associated with a disgraced family facing potential federal racketeering inquiries. The high society echo chamber had collapsed, leaving my parents trapped in a quiet, lonely purgatory of their own making. 6 months after the opening of the foundation, I sat in my new office on the second floor of the restored warehouse. The space was a reflection of my journey. The walls were constructed of soundproof glass, offering an unobstructed view of the bustling workshop floor below. The sleek drafting table Jack had repaired during our darkest night sat in the center of the room, a silent reminder of the unbreakable bond that saved us. My art portfolios now contained groundbreaking schematics and bold marketing campaigns for the next generation of Detroit innovators. Through the glass, I could see Jack standing near a reinforced steel testing rig. He was leaning over a complex structural component, speaking animatedly with a young mechanic whose hands were covered in dark engine grease. Jack nodded, pointing to a specific pressure valve, and the young inventor smiled, his face alight with sudden understanding. The sight of my husband passing his knowledge to someone who shared his struggles filled me with a profound, quiet joy. On the smooth surface of my desk, my mobile phone began to vibrate. The low, rhythmic buzzing broke my concentration. I looked down at the glowing screen. The caller identification displayed a name that belonged to a past life, Victoria Harrington. My mother was calling. Perhaps she had finally realized the sheer magnitude of her social exile. Perhaps she wanted to offer a tearful apology to secure a portion of our goodwill. Perhaps she simply needed to hear the voice of the daughter she had so eagerly thrown to the wolves. I sat in my ergonomic chair and watched the incoming call notification pulse across the digital display. The device vibrated against the polished wood, demanding attention. In my previous life, that incoming call would have triggered a surge of anxiety, an immediate, desperate need to answer and seek her validation. I would have twisted myself into knots trying to appease a woman who was incapable of genuine affection. Today, the glowing letters on the screen evoked nothing. There was no anger, no lingering sorrow, and no desire for revenge. There was only a calm, profound detachment. I had already delivered my final verdict on the stage of the country club ballroom. I did not owe her my time, my energy, or my forgiveness. I reached out and tapped the red icon on the screen, sending the call directly to the automated answering service. A moment later, a notification appeared, signaling a new voice message. I did not press play. I did not want to hear her manufactured tears or her calculated excuses. I tapped the screen 2 more times, navigating to the contact settings. I deleted the voicemail without listening to a single second of her voice. Then I selected the final option, permanently blocking the number from ever reaching my device again. The digital tie was severed, securing the boundaries of my new reality. I set the phone face down on the desk, pushing it aside. I turned my attention back to the wide physical space in front of me. Spread across the drafting table was a large, gritty, grease-stained blueprint belonging to a new applicant. It was a bold, rough design for a kinetic energy recovery system, drawn by a local kid who had never set foot inside a university classroom. I picked up a red marking pen and began outlining the visual branding strategy for his upcoming patent filing. Below my office, the heavy bay doors rolled open, letting in the crisp afternoon air. The sound of pneumatic drills, welding torches, and the low, powerful rumble of testing engines echoed through the historic warehouse. It was the loud, chaotic, beautiful symphony of creation. We had survived the freezing dark and dismantled a corrupt empire to reach this exact moment. We were no longer defending our right to exist. We were laying the steel foundation for a new, unbreakable legacy. We often confuse the accumulation of wealth with the creation of a lasting legacy. In the manicured suburbs and gated communities that define a highly idealized slice of the American dream, there exists a dangerous, silent epidemic. It is the tragic conflation of financial provision with genuine emotional responsibility. When we look back at the harrowing and ultimately triumphant journey of an exiled heiress and a blue-collar mechanic, we are not just observing a tale of corporate warfare or technological triumph. We are witnessing a profound, devastating autopsy of modern parenting. The collapse of the Harrington dynasty serves as a stark mirror, reflecting the quiet systemic failures that occur when a traditional family structure is hollowed out by vanity, leaving behind only the brittle shell of conditional love. A traditional family is meant to serve as a sanctuary, a secure, unwavering foundation from which children can step out into a chaotic world. The primary responsibility of a parent is not to curate a perfect social image or to engineer a flawless lineage of prestigious degrees. It is to nurture the core character of the human being entrusted to their care. Yet, in prestige-obsessed cultures, this sacred duty is frequently corrupted. Parents begin to view their offspring not as independent souls requiring long-term guidance, but as extensions of their own fragile egos. They applaud the medical diplomas and the Wall Street internships, showering those achievements with business-class flights and Michelin-star dinners, while treating paths of genuine passion or manual labor with chilling disdain. This toxic favoritism teaches children a devastating lesson. Love is not a birthright. It is a commodity that must be rented through constant, exhausting submission to parental expectations. Honesty and fairness are the bedrock of any enduring relationship, but they are absolutely vital in raising children. When parents construct a false reality to control a narrative, they shatter the fundamental trust required for authentic guidance. We saw this manifest in the calculated smear campaigns and the whispered country club lies used to paint a brilliant, hardworking mechanic as a predator. Children possess an innate, almost terrifying radar for hypocrisy. They watch how their parents treat the waitress, the mechanic, and the laborer. When a mother or father gaslights their own community to preserve a polished reputation, they forfeit their moral authority. They teach their children that truth is malleable and that integrity is secondary to optics. But a lie, no matter how heavily gilded, is structurally unsound. Eventually, the weight of the truth will crush it. Emotional awareness is the true currency of effective parenting. It is the ability to look at your child and see them for who they actually are, rather than who you need them to be. Shielding children from the harsh realities of the world by swaddling them in unearned luxury does not make them strong. It makes them brittle. True resilience is forged in the fires of shared hardship. When a father weaponizes starvation, freezing bank accounts, and orchestrating evictions, he operates under the delusion that physical discomfort will break a strong spirit. He lacks the profound emotional awareness to understand that stripping away the superficial comforts only reveals the unbreakable steel beneath. By denying his daughter her inheritance, the billionaire inadvertently handed her the greatest gift a parent can bestow, the undeniable, unshakable proof of her own competence. She did not freeze in that industrial garage. She found warmth in genuine partnership and used the sparks of a welding torch to ignite her own independent empire. The story of the mechanic and the heiress resonates deeply within the fabric of American culture because it forces us to confront our own internal biases about worth, labor, and success. For generations, the true pioneers of this country were those with dirt under their fingernails and grease permanently worked into their knuckles. They were the innovators who tinkered in drafty sheds, turning impossible ideas into the engines that drove the modern world. Somewhere along the line, a segment of society forgot that profound history, choosing instead to worship the paper manipulators and the boardroom tacticians. But paper is fragile, and steel endures. Raising children with a deep, abiding respect for honest labor, regardless of the pedigree attached to it, is the only way to ensure they grow into adults capable of weathering the inevitable storms of life. It is within these raw, unspoken truths that we find our shared humanity. Narratives of shattered pedestals, broken boundaries, and reclaimed power resonate so fiercely because they reflect the quiet, agonizing wars fought in our own dining rooms. We all know what it feels like to seek validation from those who are incapable of giving it. If you have ever felt the sting of conditional affection, or if you have ever had to walk away from a toxic inheritance to build your own authentic table, I invite you to join our community. Please subscribe and follow Cherry Vengeance Stories for more compelling narratives that explore the complex, painful, but ultimately triumphant journeys of reclaiming your self-worth. Share your own experiences in the comments, because your voice might be the exact beacon someone else needs to navigate their own dark night. As we reflect on the ashes of ruined dynasties and the rise of new, gritty legacies, we are forced to confront an uncomfortable question about the nature of our own relationships. The conventional societal script dictates that blood is thicker than water, insisting that we owe our parents our undying loyalty and endless forgiveness simply because they gave us life. We are taught that family is an unbreakable contract, a debt that can never be fully repaid. But biology is merely an introduction. It is not a binding moral obligation. The true philosophy of enduring love requires a radical shift in perspective. Respect is not an inheritance. It is a daily wage that must be earned through consistent, honest action. If the hands that rocked your cradle are the same hands that hold you underwater, you are under no cosmic obligation to drown quietly just to preserve the family portrait. True loyalty is not found in blind submission to toxic authority, but in the fierce, unapologetic protection of your own peace. Look closely at the foundations you are building and the bridges you are burning. Sometimes the most profound act of family responsibility is having the courage to walk away, leaving the ghosts to haunt their empty mansions, while you step into the cold, clear air to forge a dynasty of your own.